Okay, I'm going to talk about the dynamic between the victim and the perpetrator. We could call this a victim-perpetrator complex, if you wanted to. So, to provide some examples of what I mean, we could start on the small scale, and we could point out the classroom bully who was bullying the victim, right? Bullying the weaker kid. Or we could zoom way out and look at the powerful nation who is bullying the smaller nation with their military. And an example of that would be the Israel-Gaza conflict, right? The Israel is backed by the United States military industrial complex, and they're a lot more powerful than Gaza, right? Or we could even look at our economic structure and the way that the ruling class kind of bullies the working class into submission, in effect, in order to exploit their labor, right? These are all examples of victim-perpetrator complex. And what we often do is we blame the perpetrator, right? It seems like it makes sense. We want to blame the people who are perpetrating, who are victimizing other people. And again, it might seem like this makes sense, but we have to ask ourselves why they became the perpetrator in the first place. Okay, why is it that Hamas is attacking innocent Israelis? Why is it that the IDF is attacking innocent Gazans? Why is it that the bully bullies the weak kid in the classroom? Well, in this on the small scale, that bully is probably being abused at home. He probably has a shitty home life, right? His parents are probably, I don't know, maybe they have drug problems, maybe they're abusing him. The point here is that we have to recognize that the bully often, very often rather, the victim becomes the bully. The victim becomes the perpetrator. The only difference between the victim and the perpetrator oftentimes is time itself. Okay, the reason this happens is because that bully, well, he feels powerless, right? So he tries to take his power out on somebody else. Maybe his parents are abusing him, so he goes to school and he bullies the weaker kid that he can manage, right? Or, well, what happens? I mean, what may happen after that, though? Maybe that victim, the weaker kid in the classroom, maybe he becomes the school shooter, right? This is what you have to recognize. You have to recognize that by creating a victim, you're creating a bully in the future. You're creating another perpetrator. This goes for Hamas as well. If we look at what Hamas's actions on October 7th have created, they've essentially created more victims, and in doing so, they encourage some of those victims to become perpetrators, and that's why the IDF is bombing Gaza indiscriminately. All of a sudden now you have more civilians, innocent civilians in Gaza, who have become victims of the IDF's response to Hamas, and they're victims, right? But eventually they're going to become perpetrators themselves. Eventually they're going to become perhaps members of Hamas, right? Now, that's not to say that if you're a victim, you always have to become a perpetrator. Okay, it's absolutely not true. There are exceptions to this rule, and we need to really dig into those exceptions and figure out what is common amongst them. So, oftentimes, for example, or rather, if we go back to that classroom example, the bully's bullying the victim. Sometimes that victim manages to heal that trauma. Sometimes that bully manages to heal the trauma that their parents inflicted on them, okay, through that abuse, right? How did they heal that trauma? What was the common denominator among all those people that managed to heal the trauma? The common denominator is empathy, okay? The common denominator is the fact that the victims managed to become conscious of this victim-perpetrator complex. They managed to become conscious that this victim-perpetrator complex is a vicious cycle. In doing so, they are able to forgive the perpetrator. They are able to see that the perpetrator was once a victim themselves. And in doing so, they forgive them, they become empathetic with them, and they no longer feel a need to become the perpetrator. They no longer feel a need to perhaps retaliate or make somebody else a victim, right? We need to understand that forgiveness is key here if we want to escape these vicious cycles of that this victim-perpetrator complex creates. So on another scale, if you were to look at an innocent civilian in Gaza, if they have two options. They can become another member of Hamas and try to kill more Israelis, or they can become, maybe they move to the United States. Maybe they move to the United States in order to become a social activist who tries to deconstruct the military-industrial complex that's funding Israel. That is an example of forgiveness and empathy. It's trying to solve, it's trying to basically look at the victim-perpetrator complex from a different angle and trying to dissolve it rather than become a victim of it. The thing is when you're the victim, again, you have two options. You can either heal the trauma and become and empathize and forgive and become a power for good, or you can fail to heal the trauma. Now, when you fail to heal the trauma, there's kind of two paths you can go down. You can become, there's basically two kinds of perpetrators that are then created when you fail to heal that trauma. There are direct perpetrators and indirect perpetrators, and I'm going to explain what I mean by both of those terms. Direct perpetrators are those who become the new Hamas members. If you're that Israel or innocent civilian whose family was killed in Gaza, you are the direct perpetrator when you go and join Hamas. You want to basically go attack, retaliate, get your revenge directly on your perpetrator. And in doing so, perhaps you kill innocent civilians in Israel who, well, they weren't the original perpetrator, right? They were innocent. They weren't the IDF. They weren't Netanyahu, perhaps, right? Well, this makes you a direct perpetrator. You're directly perpetrating. You're directly retaliating against your perpetrator, and in effect becoming the perpetrator. The other kind of perpetrator is an indirect perpetrator, and this is the perpetrator that most of us become when we fail to heal from trauma. This is the more common type of perpetrator. We don't necessarily go and become the victim of, or rather, we don't become a perpetrator who's attacking the people who attacked us. What we do is we essentially cause indirect harm. We indirectly contribute to this vicious cycle, this vicious victim-perpetrator complex. How do we do that? Well, again, back to that economy example I provided earlier. When you have a ruling class who's ruling over a working class, they're exploiting their labor, right? What you run into is scarcity, right? The original cause of these victim-perpetrator complexes is not any identifiable perpetrator or victim. It is something long ago. Perhaps there was a community long ago that a drought came along, and next thing you know, they're killing each other for food, right? What does this cause in the long term? Well, if you never heal the original wound that is scarcity that was caused by the drought, then essentially you're going to remain in the victim-perpetrator cycle. This victim-perpetrator cycle, as I said, infiltrated our economy today, and it infiltrated our economy thousands of years ago, and it remains in that economy today. And that's why the ruling class decides to go and exploit the labor, again, of the working class. So most people that are victims, they become the indirect perpetrator who goes and hoards resources, and in doing so, they collect excess. We could call this greed, and then that excess creates scarcity elsewhere, right? So when we create scarcity again, and we create scarcity of necessities, we cause this victim-perpetrator complex to continue. It is the original cause, as I said. So if we become the indirect perpetrator and we justify the collection of excess because of that fear of scarcity, we create more scarcity among other people, and their scarcity turns into, violence, right? It turns into the very thing we are afraid of. So by collecting excess, we are creating more scarcity and more fear. And again, the fear is the very thing we used to justify the collection of excess. We try to insulate ourselves from poverty by collecting excess. And in doing so, Again, we create more scarcity, more fear. It's circular logic. It doesn't actually make logical sense. It's a vicious cycle, just like the victim-perpetrator complex is. These things are very intertwined with each other. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. The vicious cycle of greed and fear and scarcity is intertwined with this victim-perpetrator complex. So if you become that indirect perpetrator, it's essentially characterized by cognitive dissonance. You think you're doing everything right because you're not attacking anyone directly. Meanwhile, you go and vote for the two major parties who are funding the military-industrial complex that funds the killing of innocent people. This is a recipe for disaster in the long term. Okay, it's effectively psychopathic behavior hidden by cognitive dissonance. You don't realize the harm you're causing because it's indirect, right? It's kind of hidden from you. That's what cognitive dissonance kind of implies. It's like hidden hypocrisy in a way. It's because you're not conscious of the hypocrisy. You're not conscious of the indirect manner in which you're affecting other people. That is what comes back to bite you in the ass. Psychopathic behavior is kind of justified in the name of short-term preservation when fear blinds the long-term consequences of that psychopathic behavior. In other words, if you justify greed, again, you're going to create scarcity that comes back and creates problems for other people, and those people are going to make their problems your problems. Maybe not tomorrow, but in 10 years, rest assured, their problems will become your problems. This is what I feel like the Jeff Bezoses and the Warren Buffetts don't understand. Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos I think they have pledged to give away their fortunes after their death, but what they don't realize is that the scarcity they are creating now, due to that collection of excess now, is creating the problems that will plague us, perhaps before their death, but certainly after their death. We have to empathize. We have to forgive. And again, that means we have to forgive the perpetrators too. We have to forgive the ruling class, because the minute you point the finger at the ruling class, what do? They grab onto their ways, that they grab onto their justifications for that greed even harder, because they get fearful. Next thing you know, they're building a bunker because they fear you so much, when that bunker could have been used to build roads, infrastructure, internet, public transportation, among 100 other things, right? And that billionaire wouldn't have been afraid to do those things. They wouldn't have felt the need to build a bunker until you threatened the perpetrator, right? That's not to say we shouldn't threaten violent perpetrators, or not threaten. That's not to say we shouldn't punish violent perpetrators or put them in jail, perhaps. But when you go into Gaza and you kill 2 innocent civilians for every one Hamas member, what are you doing? Well, every one of those innocent civilians has at least one family member who is now going to be radicalized, right? And you're creating more Hamas members in the future, or you're creating more tensions between Iran and Israel, perhaps, which builds the tension into perhaps a regional war, and more broadly into a world war. It's the fear of scarcity that is the original wound that caused these victim-perpetrator complexes, okay? If we treat the victims or the perpetrators, if we punish the victims and the perpetrators without treating the scarcity that caused the complex to develop in the first place, it's not going to be sufficient to solve the problem. It's really quite simple. Again, back to that example I provided of that community that ran into that drought. That community perhaps had all their needs met, they were living in harmony, and then it stopped raining one day, and their food stopped growing, and now they're killing each other for food. Maybe that community never existed. Maybe there was always scarcity. And in effect, there are always victim-perpetrator complexes. That's absolutely a possibility. However, if you look at the cumulative technological advancements we have today, we have the capacity for abundance. We have the capacity to provide for the needs of everyone. There are 600,000 homeless people in the United States, and there are 3 to 5 million empty homes. What does that imply? Well, it implies there's enough homes for the homeless people, right? And beyond. Why are those homes not being distributed properly? Maybe it's slightly a geographical issue. I'll give you that one. But beyond that, it's also because the ruling class fears poverty. They fear the woes of poverty, so they collect excess. They collect excess by trying to own all and everything. And then the working class blames the ruling class. And then that victim-perpetrator complex continues and continues and continues. It's a vicious cycle. You have to empathize with every motherfucker on the planet. Don't care if they're rich. I don't even care if they're Hamas members or IDF members or Netanyahu. You have to understand that there is a chain of events that led up to every human behavior that you see today. Reality is perfect. The past is perfect. Everything that occurred exactly as it should have. All that you can do is change the future. You cannot affect the past. You cannot affect the past by punishing victims and perpetrators endlessly without addressing the original cause, the original catalyst. So please, embrace the abundance that our technology offers us. Don't you don't need that new car lease. You don't need the new watch, the new smartphone every year. Just ease back on the materialism that I guarantee you is not making you happy, because it's not. That's why you're not happy, whether you know it or not. If you are happy, it's not materialism that made you happy, and you know that. If you're not happy, not materialism that will make you happy, and you will learn that hopefully eventually before you die. Otherwise, you're going to continue to contribute to these vicious cycles. You're going to continue to be that indirect perpetrator who is blinded by their own cognitive dissonance. Now, am I saying I'm perfect? Absolutely not. Am I saying that I don't have money in my bank account? Absolutely not. But I'm not a rich person, and I have the capacity to help people, and I think if you have that capacity, you have to exercise it. It's your duty to exercise it. If you don't, well, you're asking to become the next victim in this victim-perpetrator complex. You're asking to move from an indirect perpetrator, blinded by their cognitive dissonance, back to the victim. That's the thing. There's a lot of people who are indirect perpetrators who still think they are victims because they refuse to see the power they hold. They refuse to step out and vote for that third party, and they refuse to believe in themselves. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. Many of the indirect perpetrators are people who don't believe in themselves. They're people who don't believe that they can affect the world. But here's the thing. If you take all 8 billion people, you are only 1 in 8 billion, right? That's true. It might seem like you have no effect because you're only 1/8 billionth of the world. But in reality, a 1/8 billionth is infinitely larger than 0. That's basic math right there. You have an infinitely larger impact on the world than 0, because 1 divided by 8 billion is infinitely larger than 0. There are an infinite number of numbers between 0 and 1/8 billionth. I encourage you, again, to try to dissolve the cognitive dissonance. Try to dissolve the fear of your opposition, particularly your cultural opposition in the United States, because what we do when we prioritize these culture wars is we hinder our organization, and that organization ultimately means voting for better people. It means creating labor unions and labor strikes that span the nation and span the world. It's very easy to believe you're a victim in a first world nation if the culture division tells you that you're a victim. If the cultural divides tell you you're a victim. And that's the thing. Pick any cultural divide. Anti-vax versus pro-vax. Pro-life versus pro-choice. Each side of all of those culture divides will tell you they're a victim to the other side. Is everybody a victim, or are we just failing to organize and create the conditions that we can all thrive in? It seems like it's a lack of organization that's the problem. It doesn't seem like we're actually victims. If you feel like you're a victim, you have to understand that you are part of the society that you feel you're a victim to. Therefore, if you don't decide to change, if you don't decide to be the change that you want to see in the world, why the hell should anybody else? You have to lead by example. You lead by example by forgiving and by empathizing with your opposition. Organize across those culture divides to create labor movements, create a worker co-op, and hire people and pay them as well as you can. It's hard to make yourself a victim in a first world country when the people producing many of the goods and services you use are living in third world countries. It's this is what we call cognitive dissonance. Again, if you refuse to acknowledge the fact that you are ignoring that cognitive dissonance, or if you refuse to acknowledge the fact that you are exploiting that third world labor, that's cognitive dissonance, and you have to become conscious of that. And what that'll do is it will enable you to leave these victim perpetrator complexes behind. It will enable the empathy and the forgiveness that is necessary to take this species to the next level. That's what we want here. We all just want to have our needs met. After our needs are met, we can do anything. It's projected that the average worker in the United States and other first world countries are going to produce 7 times more than they use in coming decades. This is this is an indicator that our technology is creating the capacity for abundance. If we create all of this AI and all of these robots that are producing everything for us, but we keep transferring all of the value production to the 1%, then what we're going to do is we're going to create the conditions that don't enable us to survive. What we have to do as this technology takes over our labor is we need to share that production, share that value production with third world countries. And even beyond that, we have to reduce the labor that the average citizen is doing, the average worker is doing, and pay them twice as much for it. If you reduce the labor in half, if robots replace half of the labor, then workers work half as much and get paid twice as much. If you reduce the labor by 200%, or if you cut the labor into thirds, or into a third, and the robots take over 2/3 of the labor, humans work a third that they used to, and they get paid 3 times as much. This is the only way to create a sustainable economy. But again, you can't leave the third world behind, because then conflicts like the Israel-Gaza conflict become your problem. They become your problem because you ignored them, because you became that indirect perpetrator by ignoring the rest of the globalized world. This is what's implied by globalization. You cannot leave behind the rest of the world, because the rest of the world creates the products and services you depend on. You are dependent on the supply chains throughout the rest of the world. And if you leave them behind, the supply chains break down, and so does your lifestyle. So does in effect, your life, right? Again, empathy and forgiveness were not... forgiveness wasn't preached in the Bible for no reason. Whether God is real or not, whether Jesus was real or not, whoever wrote down those words knew what they were talking about. They understood that forgiveness was an important aspect. It was the fundamental aspect of getting out of the vicious cycles we find ourselves in. If you keep victimizing yourself, you remain in that victim-perpetrator complex. You keep contributing to that victim-perpetrator cycle, and you're never going to break out of it until you become powerful, until you empower yourself to forgive other people. And you also have to forgive yourself. You can't blame yourself for being the perpetrator. You can't blame yourself for being the indirect perpetrator. Just because you recognize your cognitive dissonance does not mean that you give yourself a hard time over it, okay? It's not the goal here. The goal isn't to shame yourself and to shame other people. The goal is to forgive yourself and forgive other people. And if you keep that in mind, it will encourage you to become a better person. It's not, again, shame is no way to a solution. Blame is no way to a solution. The only way to a solution is forgiveness. It all comes, the original cause of all of our problems comes down to scarcity. And again, we have so much capacity for abundance. I keep hammering that home. There is so much capacity for abundance on this planet that if you don't embrace it, we're going to continue until there's a world war, another world war that destroys us because we were too blind, too stubborn, too shameful, too too victimized to solve it when the answer was right in front of us the whole time. Thanks for watching.